Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsch. The idea of engaged Buddhism evolved in the middle of the Vietnam War when its founder, Thich Nhat Hanh, and a few other Buddhist monks, nuns, and lay people related Buddhist meditation practices to contemporary social issues. My next guest simply describes it as a term that refers to our social activities. It is social activism that comes out of Buddhist understanding and Buddhist practices. Joining me in studio to explain this idea of a socially engaged Buddhism is Professor Mavis Fenn from the Department of Religious Studies at St. Paul's College at the University of Waterloo. Thank you very much for coming in today.
You're welcome, Jesse.
Now, why don't we start, I guess, with the general definition of what does it mean to be an engaged Buddhist?
Well, I think you've given a very good definition of it. It's someone who's engaged in social issues from a Buddhist perspective. And they bring their personal mindfulness to more universal concerns.
So it's not, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not, let's say, mutually exclusive with different types of Buddhism. It's almost a practical approach of whatever one's Buddhist particular tradition or tendency might be. Is that correct?
Yes, it's applying your understanding of Buddhism to broader social issues.
Now, as we mentioned in the intro, it sort of arose out of the Vietnam War. Were there other social conflicts or, let's say, political protest movements in which it was further refined or further embraced or developed?
Well, I think we would make a mistake to associate it solely with the Vietnam War and with social protest. Buddhism has always been engaged, and Buddhists have always been interested in social issues. The difference, I think, is on the scale. More group organization applying to it. So there's a lot of work in terms of poverty issues, prison chaplaincy, those sorts of things. Not simply social or political protest, although that certainly does fit under the rubric.
But it is, as you say, almost a collective response to some of the social problems or social needs that every society faces. Is that correct?
Exactly. Trying to bring the wisdom of Buddhism into engagement with others to address those social issues.
Now, in terms of, let's say, the different societies or cultures in which engaged Buddhism is active, are there, I mean, is it something, let's say, that Buddhist communities around the world are embracing, or is it something that perhaps is more popular in certain Buddhist communities than others?
No, I would say that it's a worldwide embracing of social issues. There are many activist Buddhists and Buddhist groups, for example, in Taiwan. Taiwan has produced two very large groups that do a lot of social work. The relief organization Tzu Chi and Buddha's Light International, which is a lay organization attached to Fo Quang Shan Buddhism, humanistic Buddhism it's called. So it's definitely a worldwide phenomenon, and I would say that most of Western Buddhism is engaged Buddhism because of the history of social activism in the West.
Now, I would assume, but perhaps it's safe to ask, that the practice of engaged Buddhism is for the benefit of all members of society and not necessarily fellow Buddhists. Is that a correct assumption to make?
That would be a correct assumption to make. The notion is that the benefit is to all living beings, and so certainly human beings would be right up there.
Now, you mentioned also, I guess, how here in the West, engaged Buddhism is almost really integrated into the natural practice of Buddhism. Does that also exist outside of the West? Are there, I mean, you mentioned Taiwan as an example in which engaged Buddhism was really quite vibrant. Are there other communities in which, as a tradition, it has really taken hold as a means of addressing social needs and social problems?
I would think, although I can't quote statistics on it, that it's a universal aspect of Buddhism, the social engagement.
And why is it, I mean, again, perhaps this question comes from ignorance, but why has it been only, let's say, in the last century that it has been articulated almost distinctly from Buddhism, and yet, as you describe, the same sort of messages and morals are really intrinsic in Buddhism in general? Was there a reason or a cause that really allowed it to be articulated in such a specific instance?
I think that comes to do with the interaction of the West and the East in Asia during colonial and post-colonial times. It's part of what occurred when the West met the East, and certain modernization and reform tendencies within the tradition itself. That, I think, has allowed for it to be to find expression in distinctly Western ways that are compatible to the Western individual.
Now, briefly before we finish, I'm curious, you mentioned, breakfast programs and anti-poverty work. Are there other examples that you could cite for our audience just to give them, a broader depth or, sense of what engaged Buddhism actually means in the practical sense? I
think so. I think the two that I would bring to your attention is an organization called Angulimala, which was begun in the UK and focuses on prison chaplaincy, and the work done by Roshi Bernard Glassman in the United States, where they began with a community kitchen. They began to teach the homeless how to become cooks and chefs. They opened a bakery, and now they've built a couple of apartment complexes for seniors and co-ops where they train people in construction, in management, in all of the things that's necessary to put those together.
And really a sense of independence and self-reliance.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I think this has really been enlightening, if you were, as to another side of Buddhism that I think really has a substantial and important impact on society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesse. It's been a pleasure.
That was Professor Mavis Fenn from the Department of Religious Studies at St. Paul's College at the University of Waterloo. Next, we'll talk about Nichiren Buddhism. That's coming up right after this short break. You're watching 3D Dialogue.